Today, I want to go further back than I've gone yet in these discussions. And I want to talk to you about Gainesville's Confederate past. And I'll confess that the reason I chose that, and please remember I'm a historian who had to teach all of these things for a long time. I routinely refer to a lot of state governors and state legislators as neo-Confederates. And I started thinking about what the various meanings of that are to me as a historian. And I thought I would explore Gainesville's Confederate past a little bit with an eye toward that. So what you want to remember is that Gainesville as a city wasn't founded until 1853. Okay. The American Civil War starts in 1860. Okay. So you want to recognize that Florida is basically a frontier, and Gainesville is a small frontier town. Okay. And despite that, by the fourth year of the war, it reached Gainesville, and there was a Battle of Gainesville. I urge all of you to read the marker right out in front of City Hall about that. All the residents of Gainesville watched it. It happened absolutely in the town square. And the Confederates won. And because a surviving Union officer was shamed by what had occurred, he inflated the number of Confederates in this area, and all the Union forces pulled back to Jacksonville and to St. Augustine and did not reappear again until the war was over. So Gainesville was part of Florida's Confederate past, and because of that, it had the same general experiences during Reconstruction that many southern towns did. And those were both positive and negative. Gainesville's first city charter, 1869, right behind your mayor there. And that is 4 years after the American Civil War ends, and while the South is still under military occupation. One of the things the Union forces did was to regularize a lot of things, and the requirement for city charters was, oddly enough, one of them. The federal troops were withdrawn in 1877, basically 1878, and there weren't very many around here. And when I taught at Santa Fe, one of my favorite essay questions that I'd like you guys to ponder is, if you know about Reconstruction, is what was reconstructed and what was not. That was the prompt. So, definitely, physically, we were rebuilt. We hadn't had a lot of damage. And by the end of the Civil War, Gainesville got its first big influx of population, many of whom were Union people who had been down here during the war. And the same thing, by the way, happens after World War II. People come here, they serve in the military, they go, oh, Florida's great. And Gainesville benefits from it. So federal troops were withdrawn. In 1896, the Supreme Court agreed that segregation would be allowed, provided that facilities for both races were equal. And the South returned in many ways, and Gainesville returned in many ways to its old power structure, which brings me to Old Joe. Okay. In 1904, Gainesville, which then had a population of about 4,000 and was the fourth largest city in North Florida, in Florida, in the whole state, put up a Confederate memorial. The ceremony was hugely attended, and the putting up of the memorial, like all of them across the South, was sponsored by a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And the reason you want to know about this is the way historians think about it. The United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Confederate memorials were part of creating what historians call the myth of the lost cause. And you should just Google that and read it. And it was basically designed for a couple of reasons. One being that most of the Civil War veterans by 1904 were aging and dying. And if you think modern vets have PTSD, try reading about Civil War battles. So their wives and mothers resurrected a myth that literally was designed to make them feel better about the horrible thing that had occurred. And if you don't know, 620,000 Americans died in the American Civil War. The next closest is World War II, with about 250,000. So this myth was created, and the reason I bring this up is that I was raised in Florida. I'm a native, and I'm old, and those are the stories my family told me about the American Civil War. And that's the reason statues like Old Joe are very, very important, because they represent that myth in a very physical way. There are others. Kirby Smith was just removed in Washington and replaced with Mary McLeod Bethune, a perfectly appropriate choice, and for the whole reason. Okay. Here, Old Joe came down without a lot of furor. There were a lot of public meetings, but once it was decided, it was okay. And you can go see him. He's out in the UDC cemetery in Rochelle. He was moved out there very quietly. United Daughters of the Confederacy. He's been replaced by a statue that has a perfect message. Know your history and learn from it. And that's the legacy of Gainesville's Confederate past.